through and share with you really, I suppose, our thoughts on where we think we are in this whole current pandemic and strange world that or strange reality that we're living in at the moment. I kind of wanted to say just a little pay tribute really, because in the chair in which I am sitting, being metaphorically, it does seem to me that you, the HR professionals out there amongst our clients, are definitely your frontline workers. From that very, very immediate response that we all had, the dealing with people, whether it was closing workplaces, sending people to work remotely, that first period was pretty intense, wasn't it? And talking to lots of clients and lots of colleagues, I think there's absolutely no doubt that HR were front and centre of all of that. So I just want to pay tribute and say I salute you, because you did a fantastic job. And as well as bearing the strain of the financial, emotional, psychological impact of this sudden, strange new environment, you also had to kind of get on with the job and look after yourselves. So I sincerely hope you are looking after yourselves. That's my little speech at the beginning I just wanted to say. So what are we going to try and cover today? Well, Kerrie and I are looking at, I think it's sort of two halves that we've been in really. There was the response and survive, and then we're moving into, hopefully, sustain and thrive. So that's kind of the direction of travel of our talk today. We are going to be talking about, we had that immediate response when an awful lot of work happened very, very quickly. Whether you are still working or whether you're working differently or whether you've got lots of people furloughed, there's been massive change and there's been a lot to do and a lot to cope with and a lot of new stuff to understand. And yes, the AKA title of this talk was Beyond the F Word, meaning beyond the furlough word. We're not focusing hugely on that, but I will just touch upon that, only the sort of most recent changes later in the talk. So 4 sections we're going to try and get through today. First of all, Kerrie is going to talk about sustaining and managing a remote workforce, because without a doubt, an awful lot of people will still have remote workforces now, and actually it looks like for the foreseeable future. So hopefully that will be helpful, some thoughts and sharing our I guess, intelligence around those. The next section is also how we start to look to unlocking from lockdown. Obviously, there was a roadmap which came out mid-May. We are gradually starting to see different things opening up. And as far as the working environment is going, I'm going to be talking about that, both from the sort of physical unlocking the working environment, but also about the people returning to the working environment and the implications of that. Inevitably, and I don't think it's a surprise to anyone to say this, and we're already seeing it, people whose thoughts are turning to and need to restructure. So Kerrie is going to touch upon talking about where there are actually changes coming, be that restructuring, redundancies, or change in terms and conditions. So she'll do that third section. And then finally, I'm going to try to look to the future a little bit. Some of the positives, there are positives, and we also need to focus on that final bit, the sustain and thrive. So how are we going to help our businesses and people thrive going forward? So quite a lot to cover. As ever, we always do like to try and answer questions. And although I've got you all muted, sorry about that, it'd be chaos otherwise. What we will do is, as I say, use the Q&A functions and the chat box function, and I will try and sort of pick up a few questions at the end of each section, but then we'll keep trying to get through the timetable. So hopefully that all makes sense, and that's what you were expecting. And I'm now going to hand over to Kerrie, who's going to go first.
Brilliant. So good morning, everyone, and apologies for my outburst at the beginning for those who are there. IT is not my strong point, so it's quite ironic that I'm doing the section about working from home. So never mind. As it won't have escaped many of you, probably all of you now, if you can work from home, then you must work from home. That is what the government is currently saying. And so more people than ever before are currently working from home. Indeed, the likes of Twitter, Google and Facebook are saying that they're not going to have people back in their workplaces until January 2021. And I know of a lot of other businesses that are saying that September of this year is going to be the earliest that they consider bringing people back into work. Some places are going one step further. Twitter, for example, are saying, if you are enjoying working from home and you want to make that a permanent thing, then let us know and we're happy to let you do that. And as without wanting to prejudge what Kerrie might be saying about bringing people back into the workplace, I think we might well see a bit of combination working going on, because to manage the numbers in the workplace, you might need some people to continue to work from home, albeit on different patterns perhaps. So it raises a lot of issues for the HR team, people working from home when perhaps they didn't so much before, or didn't at all before. And I suppose what we need to start with is, well, employment law still exists, albeit when it was put in place, it wasn't put in place on the basis of a global pandemic, and we are having to interpret it in light of newfangled concepts like furlough and things like that have been rushed in by the government. So there's a number of tricky issues that you might have already been trying to overcome with managing your remote workforces, and those that are probably still causing concerns. The first of which, usually top of most people's list, is health and safety. So what are your obligations in terms of maintaining the health and safety of your workforce, albeit not in the workplace? So under the Health and Safety at Work Act, you have, as employers, have a duty to protect the welfare and health and safety of your employees so far as is reasonably practicable. And that is both in terms of the workplace and in terms of the systems of work, which could be working from home. Employees also have a duty under the Health and Safety at Work Act to protect their own health and safety. So hopefully your employees aren't doing too much of the juggling a laptop on a work surface whilst making a cup of tea and having a toddler in the other arm. But I imagine that there are some that are doing that out there. They've also got the Management of Health and Safety at Work regulations, and they state that you have a duty to carry out suitable and sufficient work risk assessments. So you might have already carried out a general risk assessment now that a lot of your staff might be working from home and just doing a general risk assessment. But it might also be the case that you need to consider specific individuals. Perhaps they are at more risk because of disabilities, or you know that they need things like ergonomic keyboards, sit-stand desks in the workplace, which obviously highlights a potential risk. And it might be that under their own duties, the employees have come forward and said, actually, I am struggling with the equipment that I've got, for example. So it might be worth implementing a two-stage process, because clearly at the moment you can't go into everybody's home and start looking at what are they doing to work from home. What you could potentially do is sort of do a two-pronged attack where you ask your employees to assess themselves at home, perhaps providing pictures, and if you haven't got your own form or workstation assessment tools, then on the Health and Safety Executive website, they've got a toolbox where you can find things like a workstation checklist that you could ask them to download and have a look at what they're doing and whether it's appropriate for what they need. And then perhaps feedback to you what they have assessed, and then you review it and make sure that you are helping them if they need help with, for example, an ergonomic keyboard or the like. So I think it needs to be a two-stage process. You can't just completely delegate that responsibility, because it is the employer's responsibility to maintain that health and safety. So to make it suitable and sufficient, I would recommend that you are having some input into that review and looking at it and suggesting things that could help. In terms of health and safety as well, it's not just about that physical workspace, it's also about mental well-being in this current climate. I imagine that there are a lot of people sat at home at the moment who may not have seen a soul for a long time, and this is no doubt going to have an impact on people's mental health and well-being, particularly those who might already have had mental health issues. So as an employer, you have that duty to maintain their welfare. So perhaps it's worth signposting your employees to relevant websites and assistance programs such as Mind, Carers UK for those that are having caring responsibilities. And on the mentalhealth.org.uk website, there are a number of really helpful hints and tips on how to maintain well-being outside of the workplace and working from home. And that includes things like trying to encourage a routine, perhaps having conference calls via Zoom as a team regularly, so that people can see a friendly face, people can talk to one another, and it also encourages people to get up and actually have a shower and get dressed, because I think there are a number of people who might have got away with working in their pajamas for some time. Also, it might be worth considering having different social and work channels, so perhaps setting up a WhatsApp group for the more lighter side of talking with your colleagues, such as what did you get up to at the weekend? Not much probably, but you might have baked a nice cake that you could send a picture of, and then that leaves an email as a work channel instead. And it's also important to ensure that your employees are having relevant rest breaks. Where someone is sat in front of a computer screen for a long period of time, remember your visual display unit obligations of allowing people to have, breaks from their screen every so often, and also under the working time regulations, making sure people actually do take a 20-minute break for every 6 hours that they're working, encouraging them to stand up, go for a walk, perhaps make themselves a cup of tea, because it's easy to get bogged down in what you're doing at home. And whilst a lot of employers before were not keen on the idea of people working from home and the impact that could have on productivity, a lot of surveys are actually showing that there's almost a reluctance to switch off. People are just doing more and more and more because the lines between work and home are blurred. So you also need to bear in mind those with disabilities. Are there any PCPs that you need to be looking out for in terms of working from home that require reasonable adjustments? And PI claims. We're currently getting swamped by emails from PI lawyers saying, oh, remember, this could potentially be a risk. I'm sure they're just trying to make sure that they can line their pockets later on down the line. But that said, they are encouraging us to be proactive in terms of ensuring that employers are looking out for their staff, making sure that they have got lines of communication open to talk about the impact that this is all having on their mental health and well-being, and particularly just saying be mindful and reach out to those people who are isolated, who might be young or vulnerable or have health issues that might require a little bit of extra hand-holding during this time. So in terms of your home office and people working from home, what are your obligations in terms of funding it or providing the equipment? Well, generally speaking, there is no obligation to fund a home office. However, I would caveat that quite a lot in terms of what have you got in your contract of employment, what have you got in your handbook in terms of expenses. You might have broad policies about that. And also, how are your staff going to effectively work from home if they haven't got those equipment? So your view on this may differ between the high-level executive who's probably got a home office that they've already funded themselves, and the people who are perhaps less well paid, who may not have the access to IT facilities that the other people may have. So you may take a different view depending on seniority. Also, it could have an impact upon the reasonableness of the instruction for them to work from home and their ability to effectively work. And also a reminder about those reasonable adjustments. If you do think that employees have a disability that you require a reasonable adjustment for, then the employer is under an obligation to pay for those reasonable adjustments. As well as the fact that you've got the health and safety obligations, and if you identify that there is a risk there, you might need to overcome it by providing the sit-stand keyboard, the ergonomic keyboard, for example. So that's a question that quite often comes up. Another issue that we've been hearing quite a lot of is juggling childcare responsibilities and work. Now, that is a real challenge at the moment, especially as we've now got the schools that are potentially not going back in full until perhaps September. So you're going to have a number of members of staff who are juggling homeschooling and doing their work. So the government's view on this is that employers should be being as flexible as they possibly can be. And that's easier said than done for a lot of people. But ACAS have also introduced some working from home guidelines on this, and have said that perhaps employers should look at agreeing different or flexible hours, perhaps not expecting people to work a full day or a full week, reducing targets, having flexibility on deadlines. So there's a lot of things that ACAS are saying you could do to try and make this juggling act a little bit easier. If not, then you have got the fail-safes of, you know, unpaid time off for dependents and parental leave, albeit I would urge you to act with caution if you're going to go down those routes. Make sure that you have an open and honest communication, because the last thing you want to do is enter yourself into the risk of sex discrimination claims, for example, because we still, despite all the moves that the government and, you know, the law has made to try and make it more equal in terms of childcare between men and women, it is still a sort of bias on the women being the primary caregiver. So that is something that you might be concerned with as well. Another one is data protection. So maybe your employees left the office in a bit of a panic, picked up what they could, took it home with them, are using IT facilities that maybe they're not used to using because they're working from home. So a useful piece of information that I found was on the ICO website. They've got COVID-19, how do I work from home securely? So that's actually quite handy. It gives a lot of hints and tips on how to protect data protection and things like that from home. And you might want to review and update your IT and communications policy in light of perhaps some of those suggestions, and make sure that everybody is aware of your IT and communications policy. So the sort of tips that they were putting forward was, you know, make sure that people are using passwords, those simple things, making sure that there's no access to the work computer by other members of the household. I did hear about another law firm that had quite an interesting incident where a teenager got onto the work computer and uploaded a TikTok dance video that went viral on the firm's Twitter page. So perhaps not what was in keeping with their brand. Then also, what about those hard copy documents that they might have picked up and ran with on the day that they got told go home? Well, maybe you might need to think about how they're storing them, how they can return them to the office, how they should destroy them if they're no longer needed. And things like this video call itself, remember that the person who hosts it is the data controller for the purposes of Data Protection Act. So a few things there to consider in terms of IT communications, your policies, and how to communicate that to your staff. Another issue that hopefully you aren't all having to deal with, but may well be, is disciplinaries and grievances. So the thing to remember here is the usual law applies, the usual ACAS code applies. So can you reasonably carry out a reasonable disciplinary or grievance at this time? And ACAS have realised this and thought, it is a little bit trickier than usual. So we'll put in place a new set of guidelines called Disciplinary and Grievance Procedures during the Coronavirus Pandemic. And so they've tried to point out a few things that might cause issues to employers and give you a few thoughts so that you can conduct your disciplinaries or grievances as fairly and reasonably as possible. So the first thing that they've pointed out is actually, if people are currently on furlough, then you can actually still go through a disciplinary or grievance with them, albeit in any guise. So it could be that they are the person taking the notes or the person investigating or interviewing. So that is allowed, albeit voluntarily. Now that is really helpful guidance, ACAS, because clearly if you've raised the grievance, then you're going to be interested in attending that grievance. But if you're the subject of a disciplinary, then I doubt that you're going to be so concerned with turning up to that voluntarily. So that's not particularly helpful. Then otherwise, you've got to consider, can you carry out a fair and reasonable procedure remotely? So you would want to have a think about the sensitivity and the urgency of the case. Does it need to be dealt with right now? What about any reasonable objections that you are receiving, especially if they're on furlough? Has the people concerned got access to the appropriate IT and technology and the platforms that you might want to use? Do you need to make reasonable adjustments for people that might not be able to use it or might have a disability? Have you got access to all of the evidence that you need in order to mount the potential disciplinary or carry out the investigations? It might be that it's all left in the office. The other issue is, has the employee got access to it? They might need to be able to access things that are in the office in order to counter the allegations against them. So that could impact on fairness. They also have the right to be accompanied. So if you are going to do an investigation or a hearing over the internet, then you'll need to make sure that their companion can also attend, and that there are potential avenues for them to have secret conversations in adjournments. And availability issues. So you might actually find that their companion can't attend within the usual 5-day time scale. So you might want to extend that further if they are saying they're having difficulties because of caring responsibilities or the like. If you decide you want to record your meeting, then you need to get consent for it in advance. Usual data protection obligations there. And what I would say is the same limitation rules apply for discrimination and unfair dismissal claims and all of the employment tribunal claims. So where things are being dragged out and things aren't being dealt with quite as efficiently as they may once have done, you may find that in order to protect from limitation, people are bringing claims halfway through a grievance or halfway through a disciplinary. So it could be quite challenging, albeit different tribunals are now working at different speeds if they are bringing those claims. So I think one of the trickiest things that you could potentially have to come across during remote management is performance management of underperforming employees whilst they are being working from home. And I think the most important thing is to be able to ensure that you can somehow monitor their productivity and that you are open and communicative on exactly what is expected of them and make sure that it is reasonable expectations. Now, I think that I've come across a few examples of this whilst we've been off at home, and one of them was a manager who was very fed up with an employee. They hadn't been pulling their weight for some time. They were very frustrated and decided that they wanted to go through a performance management process. Then COVID hit and they were finding that they were managing a remote workforce, and they decided that they wanted to nonetheless still go ahead with this performance management. However, the person concerned was a single young female who was responsible for several children who were all running around screaming all the time. So clearly setting the objectives that she needs to meet to go through performance management, you need to be incredibly careful there in terms of being fair and reasonable and being able to monitor it correctly, because you are opening yourself up to potential arguments there about, you know, sex discrimination and potential breach of trust and confidence if you are actually setting objectives that just are not reasonable and not able to be reached. So you need to bear in mind the current situation if you are going to be doing that, and make adjustments accordingly. I suppose the flip side of that is you've also got the potential that you've got good employees that you also need to be ensuring you're recognising the good performance. looking to the future, doing performance reviews, were people being lined up for promotion and staff development? You need to retain that engaged workforce going forward. So just something for you to potentially consider, looking at the flip side, how are we going to encourage people to carry on that good performance? And another little happy note is recruitment. There are still some people out there that are recruiting, I'm being told. And actually, it's not impossible to do. You can interview remotely. What I would say is, if you are going to do that, it might be worth making sure that you are really clear in any offers, that their offers are conditional upon satisfactory references, and make sure that you put in place a good probationary period, that you're monitoring exactly what they need to be doing, and also making clear what is expected of them and what they will need in terms of a home office to be able to carry out the job. And I suppose a pitfall here is to make sure that you are just not going to be seen to be discriminating against anyone who's shielding or potentially extremely vulnerable. So what are my 2 key tips for remote management? Number 1, communication. Make sure you've got those regular team meetings, those team calls, that the lines of communication are open for sensitive conversations. Keep those who are on furlough up to date with what's going on in the business, and make sure that any relevant policies and procedures are being communicated appropriately and are up to date and fit for purpose. And the second thing, manage your managers. They need to be told that it's not business as usual. You can't just do the things that you may well have once done in the business, such as performance management. They might need a bit of hand-holding in terms of what is reasonable and what isn't reasonable to expect at the moment, and to perhaps give them a little bit of pointing in the right direction in terms of displaying the softer skills, because let's be honest, at the moment I think it's just important to overall be kind, really. So that's my quick canter through managing remote workforces, and I'll hand back to Kerrie.
Thanks, Kerrie. Just checking to see if there are any questions. I don't think there are any questions at the moment, so I will crack on into the second section, and then if there are any questions to mop up, we will keep stopping and checking for questions. So as I said, the next thing I was going to talk about was the sort of unlocking of the workplace. So we had that roadmap back in May. We've started to see more businesses returning to work. I mean, obviously for some businesses out there, you may have been working throughout anyway, but as Kerrie's just talked about, part of that might have been a remote workforce. Again, depending on the workforce, you may be returning into the workplace, bringing people back from furlough, bringing people into buildings and on site when they were working from home, if they can no longer work from home because you're opening up in a different way now. So there's quite a lot of change going on at the moment, lots of planning, and we're seeing more activity and more workplaces reopening. Now, clearly in terms of the roadmap that was sort of revealed in mid-May, there were various staging posts. And going through that, the government started to issue their guidance on that new popular phrase, COVID secure. So we all got to grasp with furlough, and at the moment we're all undoubtedly getting to grasp with COVID secure. There is plenty of guidance out there. There are 8 different sets of guidance for different types of workplace, and I'm sure you've probably already looked at these on the gov.uk website. They've become the new, can you remember and work out what all the different workplaces are? So in the same way that not everyone can name the 7 dwarfs, and it's tricky sometimes remembering all the protected characteristics under the Equality Act, you now need to get to grips with what are all the different workplaces. So I would like to say a prize for the first person to post what the 8 different workplaces are. I don't know what the prize will be, but I'm sure I'll think of something. So what essentially overall do those guidances say, and what are the sorts of things that you need to be thinking about if you haven't already started? Well, Health and Safety Executive, and Kerrie sort of flagged some of this, one of the key pieces at the top of all the guidance is that you should work from home if you can. Obviously, that's going to help to alleviate pressure on public transport. It's going to help to alleviate pressure in those workplaces where you can't necessarily socially distance if every single person is back in the workplace. Socially distancing then, that's the next thing to think about. Where businesses are going back into the workplace, they have still got to abide by these general regulations, rules that we're all living under, including social distancing. Now, I know that there's a lot of debate in the news at the moment, people lobbying that that should reduce from 2 metres to 1 metre, and that might make quite a significant difference in terms of how many people you can fit into a building. But for the time being, whether it's 2 metres or 1 metres, it's still clearly something you've got to address. So when you're going back into the workplace, what you're going to be looking at is not only how people get in and out of the building. Are people going to cluster around a clocking in clock, or is there only one entrance into the building? Will they all be queuing and clustering as they arrive at work? Do you share the building with somebody else? Can you have one-way systems in and out of the building? Equally, in the actual, on the shop floor or office floor or whatever kind of floor it is, there's a workstation and proximity between workstations, but then also how you move around in the space. So again, it might be common areas you need to look at. It might be one-way systems, if that's possible, across office floors. So essentially what you're going to need to be doing is either physically or virtually walking around your workplace to think of and carry out those risk assessments that are probably something you should be doing and are doing anyway, and you will have risk assessments that cover your workplace, again, as Kerrie previously flagged. If you've got more than 5 employees, they'll be written. If you've got more than 50 employees, then the risk assessments specifically relating to COVID secure are something that you are likely to have to publish under the guidance. So you're adding to existing risk assessments, but clearly in the face of COVID-19 and in very different circumstances with these different concepts of social distancing and so forth. Cleaning regimes are something else you'll want to think about. Again, whatever cleaning regimes you've got already, what are you going to need to do? Should there be more frequency? Are there particular areas that will need to be cleaning? Who will be responsible for them? Will people have facilities in order to be able to clean their own desks and equipment? How do you deal with different people going up to use different pieces of equipment, workstations, etc.? Health and hygiene, in the sense of personal health and hygiene. When people arrive, if they've been travelling to the office and they've perhaps been on public transport, are they able to immediately access a bathroom in order to wash their hands, or are there lots of sanitisers around? Again, all of these are sort of additional things, additional costs as well, it's fair to say. And if you aren't already ordering, these things are available, but anecdotally, I think that there are still some difficulties in getting bulk supplies if you're looking for those. So it's something to put on the to-do list if you haven't already. There's a debate around PPE. If people wear PPE already, then clearly they will continue to do so. The government are trying to steer people away from using medical masks, for example, and saying that's not necessarily what you have to do in the workplace, as much as anything about that pressure on supply. But obviously we've started to see a slight change in the sense of face coverings and talking about using face coverings on public transport in confined spaces. So again, depending on your workplace, whether you can do the 2-metre social distancing, you may want to think about face coverings, but it's not necessarily the same as saying that, unless you're frontline healthcare or something like that, that you need these sort of PPE that they're using in hospitals and care settings, etc. Other things that start to go slightly out the periphery of the workplace are things like travel. So again, in terms of what your employees do they travel? Should they be travelling? Should you be stopping or reducing travelling, particularly if there would be otherwise a need to go on public transport? And that commute to work is probably also something to think about. A lot of people may be concerned about using public transport, and equally the government are trying to minimise the use of public transport, which is a pretty difficult issue when people are trying to return to work. Overall, because there's a lot of change in the workplace, one of the keys, and throughout this period, communication, as Kerrie said, has been key, will continue to be key. So people need to understand what changes are being made if they are going to come back possibly to a changed working environment, changed working practices. So think about how you're going to inform people ahead of their return to the workplace. Have clear policies, guidance, possibly even training, or as Kerrie said, make sure managers are communicating well. Because equally, once they are there, you need them to be following this, and to some extent you need to make sure that people are following it. So again, that might be where management have to step in. Top tip again is involve staff in the risk assessments. You may already have a union, or you may have a health and safety rep, but take input from staff. You want them to feel safe coming back to the COVID secure workplace, and the way of doing that is to communicate, get their buy-in, earn their trust, and hopefully then you have a more successful return to the workplace. So that communication before they come back, actual involvement in the risk assessments, they know how they work and what's possible and what isn't possible as much as you do, and as much as managers do. So do include them in some way, shape or form. The second area really, and just before I move on, a couple of the quite useful health and safety guides that have been produced, which are working safely with COVID-19 and talking with workers about working safely with COVID-19. They're available on the Health and Safety Exec website. So in addition to the workplace guides that the government have put on their website, it's worth looking at the health and safety. Very plain English, very easy to follow, and so they might be a useful place to start if you are about to embark on this and haven't started yet. The people impact, though, that's the really key thing about the return to the workplace, isn't it? And essentially, I think what's very key is understanding people's concerns if they have concerns. Again, you may be bringing people back who are furloughed, you may be bringing people back from working from home to working on site, and equally you may have people who've been on site all this time and suddenly they are seeing people quite literally invading their space, as they may see it, their 2 metre distance space. And so they may also be nervous if there's been a skeleton crew keeping the wheels turning about more people coming back into the workplace. So you need to understand that people will have a range of concerns. Some, anecdotally, some employers are sending out surveys just to understand what people do think about returning to work, if they do have any concerns. And the sorts of things that you're likely to come across are those people, obviously, you've got to think about, who are shielding, because they're in the extremely vulnerable group of people who've been told by the NHS, they've had their letters and their texts, and they've been told that they must stay indoors. People who are vulnerable, so that might be those people who are age 70 plus, or are pregnant, or have an underlying condition, not the extremely vulnerable who are shielding, but nonetheless a vulnerable group for whom it's recommended to stay at home still. People with childcare, as Kerrie flagged, childcare or other care issues. People perhaps who have acute anxiety, those people you're aware of who maybe already have existing underlying health conditions around mental illness or anxiety. People who generally just feel a bit fearful, feel very out of step. By the time some people get back into the workplace, they might have been sitting at home for 3 or 4 months. So again, it's quite a significant change if you have been living in these strange little bubbles, not going very far and not seeing many people. And on the flip side, there are also those who are desperate to get back to work, back into the office or on site. I can think of, who shall remain nameless, a couple of partners who, much as they love their families, they're desperate to get back into the workplace. So I'm sure you'll have some of those as well. And in terms of understanding their concerns, obviously just to flag, there are some potential pitfalls if you don't take on board particular individual circumstances. Kerrie's already flagged obviously our duties in terms of health and safety at work. Equally, employees are protected. So if they have a reasonable belief that there is a serious and imminent danger in the workplace, then they might leave that workplace, or they might take steps to protect themselves or others. And if they are then treated to their detriment or dismissed because of those actions they've taken, then you are facing claims for detriment, you're facing claims for automatic unfair dismissal. So they are day one rights, similarly to discrimination. They're the sorts of claims that protect people from day one in their workplace. They're not the sort of claim where you need any qualifying service or anything like that. And I flag them because health and safety cases are complicated. The sort of hurdles that people have to go through are quite complicated. But equally, it's not to say that there isn't the risk of those sorts of claims. Options for how you're dealing with things like that, where you do have people who are reluctant or refusing to come back into the workplace. Again, really, it comes down to that communication piece, because as much as possible, you need to try and demonstrate to them that you have taken all steps that you need to take, that you've carried out risk assessments, so that you can establish, if needs be, that actually you are looking to minimise all danger in the workplace in terms of COVID-19. And that will go towards you being able to defend your position if you find yourself in that situation. I'm not going to try and go into all the complexities of those sorts of claims and the legal tests in this seminar, but suffice to say, as long as you are aware that there is that potential, then all the more reason to communicate with staff and make sure you take into account their particular circumstances. And it may be that they have protected characteristics that you need to think about also. So by that I mean, of course, protected characteristics under the Equality Act. So again, some of the potential risks, if you're not making sure that you're really communicating to staff that you've done everything to follow government guidelines, health and safety exec guidelines, and try and help to encourage them to see that you have got in place safe measures and it is a safe working environment. You equally need to take account of people who may have underlying disabilities, where you have obligations to make reasonable adjustments. There's a risk of facing claims there. And similarly, some of those other groups, as Kerrie flagged, maybe with childcare issues, potential sex discrimination claims, and so forth. Maternity and pregnancy also, again, you might need to take account of someone who is concerned about coming into a workplace if they're currently pregnant. Possibilities and options to address some of those issues as they come up. Again, there will be lots of different hypothetical situations, different means of addressing them, but of course it might mean that you're going to use things like furlough for longer. It might be that you agree unpaid leave, as Kerrie said, whether that's parental leave or dependence leave, though much shorter in the case of dependence leave. Agree sabbaticals, agree that people can use annual leave. There might be various different ways of resolving immediate concerns in the shorter term. Clearly, there might be an eventual long-term issue that starts to brew, but do just take care when you have got people who are flagging concerns, because there are potential risks and downsides and pitfalls. So again, to avoid any fallout, really the key is communicate, be aware of people's individual circumstances. And the final sort of thing here, really, just where you are looking at potentially bringing people back from furlough, but maybe are building up gradually, and so you're not necessarily bringing everyone back into the workplace from furlough or from furlough to work at home, then think about how you bring people back and who you bring back. Avoid any sense that you are in any way discriminating against people. Some people may prefer to stay furloughed if otherwise it would be a choice of going into the workplace and they need to shield. So definitely you don't try and force somebody who's shielding back into the workplace. But equally, they might be able to work from home. You no doubt sometimes had to react quickly, but equally, hopefully, you have been careful about furloughing people when you've had to select people. You might have been rotating people so that it feels fair and even to people. And what you don't want to do is undo any goodwill that you had when going into furlough, for example, and damage that goodwill as you come out of it. Just in terms of, I said I wasn't going to talk too much about furlough because I'm sure we all talked a lot about that at the beginning. But just in terms of the recent changes, I'm sure everybody's probably got on top of the fact that in terms of the funding contributions, things stay the same to the end of July, and then there's a bit of a taper. So employers start paying the employer national insurance contributions and pension contributions in August. The government's percentage goes down to 70%. Employer has to top up to 80% in September, and then down to 60% and topping up 20% by the employer in October. So relatively straightforward, although there are going to be additional guidelines out tomorrow that might just make any sort of questions and queries around that a little more clearer. But one of the key differences, and this is the thing I really wanted to flag, was the idea that actually people can start partially working, being partially furloughed from the 1st of July. So those decisions about how you bring people back into the workplace have that additional, hopefully, helpful measure by the government that you can start bringing people back part-time if you don't have enough work for them immediately to go back to full-time hours, and they can remain partially furloughed. And again, I'm sure that you will be aware, if you hadn't furloughed somebody by yesterday, they're not going to be able to be furloughed after the 1st of July. So no new entrants into the scheme after the 1st of July. They have to have been furloughed for 3 weeks before then. But the one key thing I also wanted to add, because it's perhaps not been so highly flagged, but some of you may be aware of it, is that after July, you can only claim for the maximum number of people that you have claimed for prior to that date. So June really is the last point at which you can get the highest number of people that you might have furloughed at any one time, get that claim in, because after that, you won't be able to exceed the maximum number you've claimed for previously. And the reason I flag it is because if, for example, you've been rotating people and you think, well, we've had 2 people who've been rotating, that's great, because from the 1st of July, what we'll now do is have both of them partially working and both of them partially furloughed. You're going to have to look at the maximum number that you had furloughed at any one time, because whilst they might both be eligible to partially work and partially furlough, you can't suddenly start adding a greater number after the 1st of July. I hope that makes sense, but I thought it was worth flagging because I think it's one detail that might not have been as clearly flagged as some others. What I'm going to do now, though, is just check to see if there are any questions. I can't see that there are, so I will hand back over to Kerrie. I think Kerrie's having trouble unmuting herself. Have you managed to unmute yet, Kerrie?
There we are, brilliant. For some reason it wouldn't let me unmute unless you let me. I think it's saying you've spoken enough. Never mind. So brilliant. So I suppose leading on from where we've just got to, we might get into a position where actually we need to start doing the harder things, like restructuring, making redundancies, or changing terms and conditions. It's not something that anyone relishes, but I'm not proposing to go into the mechanics of it. I'm kind of going to assume that you've all either had to deal with that or know in basic terms what you need to do. But I just wanted to flag a few COVID specific things that you might want to consider. And I suppose the first thing is the wider context. So where you are making these redundancies, it's not going to be popular, clearly, not just amongst your staff, but also, you know, the government have been labouring about how they want to retain jobs via the, you know, the furlough scheme. And the media has been all over those companies that are making mass redundancies. So I suppose the key there is to remember the context in which you'd be doing it and to be sensitive to that, really. Because clearly your rationale is going to be open to criticism. Your employees are going to be saying, well, this is an unprecedented situation. How do you know that this is what the position is going to be in a few weeks' time, a few months' time? How can you accurately predict how many people that you're going to need, how much revenue is going to be coming in? So there is going to be those challenges that you might face to your redundancy or restructuring rationale. So you need to be ready to answer those. And I suppose one of the first things you'd want to do is consider whether there are any alternatives to redundancy before making that final decision. So can you extend furlough? Like Kerrie said, it's kind of tapering off now, but it is still there for those that are already furloughed in some way, shape or form until the end of October. You've also got the potential for natural wastage, recruitment freezes, stopping or reducing overtime, offering early retirement to volunteers. Now, I would put a bit of a caveat in there in terms of making sure that you're not opening yourself to any age discrimination, but you might have a few people who have been waiting out for that lovely redundancy package or you know, retirement package. Retraining and redeploying your employees. So perhaps there are parts of your business that are suffering at the moment, but actually there are other parts that are completely flourishing, and it might be that you can actually restructure so that you are putting your resources where they're needed. Sabbaticals, secondments, short time working, and layoff. So there's a lot of different things there, one of which is perhaps pay freezes or pay cuts. Now, that one is going to be particularly difficult to sell. You're going to have basically a two-tier workforce potentially. If you've been using the furlough scheme, you might have people who've been out doing nothing for 80% of their salary, who then say, oh, why should I come back and do work for less than 80%? Likewise, you might have other people who have been holding the fort, picking up work where other people have been furloughed, feel like they've been doing an amazing job, and then you take them into a room and ask them whether they're prepared to do the same but for less money. So it's going to be a difficult sell, and you're going to need to think about how you're going to position that with each of the people that are going to be affected. And if you think that actually you're going to end up having to potentially terminate and re-engage on new terms in order to get that across the line, then you need to also remember your collective consultation obligations and filing your HR1 form with BEIS. So there is those additional risks really. Also, like Kerrie said, pooling and selection, be really careful, because clearly there will be people who are clinically extremely vulnerable or shielding that may feel that they're being targeted or treated less favourably. Likewise, those with mental health problems or caring responsibilities. So yeah, you need to be able to justify why you're selecting the pools that you are. And then the costs of it. So you might want to think about the timing of when you do this in terms of that staggered and tapering off of the furlough scheme that Kerrie just discussed. Obviously, there are going to be costs that the CJRS are not going to pick up, such as any notice period that is worked outside of the furlough scheme, or a payment in lieu of notice, because clearly they're then not working for that time. Holiday, that you will need to pick up, and that would need to be paid at 100%, and statutory redundancy pay or contractual redundancy pay. So they're all things you need to be able to put in the pot. And I think the key here really for me is just to take this slowly. Get all your ducks in a row. The furlough scheme is there if you've been using it as a sort of safety net to give you that time and space to consider really what do you need to do and how can you go about it. And that should give you enough time to try and come up with your answers to why it is that you're doing it and why is it that they're being pulled before you end up being challenged on it. Because I think, judging from where we were in 2008 when we last had a potential recession, we saw unprecedented levels of unfair dismissal claims, and a lot of that may come down to the fact that if people lose their jobs now, then they might be worried about where their next job's going to come from, and so we did see a lot of claims against employers for unfair dismissal, many of which didn't actually have any merit, but people doesn't cost them anything to put in a claim and they thought they might as well have a go, and that's just time and resources that you don't need to spend. So where you can, just slow down and take your time and be confident in the procedure that you're going to go through before embarking on it. So that's my top tips for that, and I'll hand back over to Kerrie.
Just to say, we have a question, Kerrie, so I think this is one for you, because it's a question about shielded employees. Right. And if shielded employees are included in selection pools for redundancy, any advice? I think you've possibly partially covered that anyway, perhaps, but shielded employees at risk of redundancy.
So I think ultimately you need to be able to justify why is that shielded employee within the pool of people that may need to be made redundant, and that really does need to be based upon the role itself, not their ability to be in the office or not in the office. Where possible, you need to make reasonable adjustments to ensure that the person who needs to work from home because they've extremely clinically vulnerable can do so. So ultimately, just the fact that they can't go into an office or something should not be a ground that you're looking at. Instead, it needs to really be on the grounds of what roles need to go, and making sure that you're using fair selection criteria across that group, basically, that doesn't detrimentally impact upon those who are shielding.
Thanks. Okay, I'm gonna move on now then. So the final section, as I said, trying to end on an up note, is thinking about the future. We talked about sustain, and what about thrive? So what lessons learnt are there? Is there anything positive that we can take from this? And actually, I think there are a lot of positives. I mean, certainly in terms of what we've seen and some of the conversations we've been having, observations really are that everybody has coped amazingly well. Businesses have done things they simply didn't know that they could do. There's been incredible agility and adaptability. There's been a speed of decision making that probably you didn't realise your leaders or your managers could be quite so decisive, when in normal times it might take months to get a decision taken over something, and suddenly the purchase of 50 laptops in order that people could work remote from home was taken very swiftly. There's also been a lot of collaboration seen, I think, arising out of this. So lots of different teams who wouldn't perhaps normally coincide much. There's had to be an awful lot of collaboration between different teams, different departments, and again, a real sense of lots of people pulling together, and some real sort of stars that have come out of this. A lot of innovation and finding solutions, and that might be tech solutions, but also sometimes it's been perhaps much simpler things that you might have seen, where teams and different groups have come up with ways they can cope with remote working, for example, and how they can do things differently. Probably a lot greater flexibility from the workforce, quite clearly, who've been asked to work in different ways, but also greater flexibility from managers who might now realise, oh, actually, it can work, can't it, slightly differently than the way we have always done it. So it might, again, be that there have been learnings on both sides about just what is possible. And also, I think the leadership and communications certainly tended to see that businesses have had no choice but to be very upfront and honest with staff about what they're doing and why they're doing it, when they've been asking people to make sacrifices to work from home, to reduce their pay, to reduce their hours, a whole range of different measures that businesses had to implement when they had to step in very quickly. So all of those things really, an awful lot of positive buy-in, a lot of positive communication certainly seems to have come out of it. And certainly there seem to be things that you want to grasp hold of and take forward. Again, anecdotally, talking to different businesses, there's a sense that some of those things that you've always known you needed to do, or maybe you were thinking of doing, suddenly you've just done them, and you've realised that they can work, or it's just accelerated some changes that you were thinking of implementing. So again, it may well be that there are indeed opportunities and new innovations and new lessons learned that you can take forward, and probably really key to try and hang on to some of those and take the best things forward if you're going to thrive and if your people are going to thrive. For some people, for not everybody, some people have loved working from home, some people have hated working from home, but there's a real sense that people are realising that actually more flexibility and working in different ways is probably something that they all welcome. So again, how are you going to carry that forward if you're going to carry any of that forward? And how do we sort of hang on to this, and how do we try and make sure that we're helping our business to thrive in what is certainly going to be a different environment for some time to come? How do we future-proof ourselves? Well, what we do, my top tip, is to follow the path. And I admit to having pinched this acronym from somebody else, but I thought it worked, and I thought it's very true, and it does fit with the things I've just been talking about. So following the path, what does that mean? Well, it means people. People are front and centre of this. People have been front and centre of this. The positive responses from people, and that's something that you've got to thank, be grateful for, acknowledge, and hopefully hold on to, keeping your people front and centre. Agility. most businesses have realised and discovered that they've absolutely got it in spades. And what you really need to do is to take that forward, because the agile businesses now, the ones that have adapted, can continue to adapt. They're the ones that are going to thrive going forward. Trust. Again, it does seem to me, and I'm talking anecdotally, but I have talked to lots of businesses and clients, but an awful lot of trust has had to be there necessarily. There has been better communication. People have bought into what they were asked to do and the sacrifices they've been asked to make. And that trust is something you want to take forward. Managers possibly know, the good ones know their people better now than ever before, because they've communicated with them in different ways. They've seen the cat, the dog, the toddler run by the screen when they've had a Zoom meeting. And just that sort of human element of people getting to know their staff has possibly been a positive thing, hopefully, the ways that people have kept in touch and supported each other as well. And health. And by health, I don't just mean the sort of COVID-19 health. Obviously, everybody's health is important. But also, as Kerrie equally mentioned, it's about mental health, well-being. And they're not new ideas. They have been very much part of the agenda, particularly for HR, for some time. But occasionally you might have felt a little like you were pushing water uphill, that people, yes, they said and acknowledged and bought into the concepts, but perhaps they didn't really feel it. And I think the key difference now is that it's impossible not to feel and appreciate and understand the need for support and looking after the well-being of staff in the current environment, because let's be honest, there can't surely be a person in the land who has not been affected by the current situation. So everybody in the organisation probably gets it now in a way they didn't get it before. It's not something that just happens to others, it is something that's happened to all of us. So following the path, people, agility, trust and health, hopefully is one of the ways of simply remembering how you can try and help to take your business forward and thrive. And on that note, that is the sort of content that Kerrie and I were going to talk about. If anybody's got any other questions or chat, then please do flag them and include them. And if not, I would say I will try and unmute you. I'm not sure if I can, and I don't know if that will create chaos, but do send your comments and feedback. I'm not sure if I'm allowing you, I think, to unmute yourselves. So possibly you can unmute yourselves now if you want to. Oh, no, maybe I've just muted you all again. I'm not sure. Hopefully you can unmute yourselves, and I'm sorry for my slightly clunky analog understanding of this technology. But do feel free to get in touch with us. I hope that it was useful, and thank you very much for taking the time to join us. Hopefully next time we may have a real life cup of coffee and a croissant or whatever you've been eating and drinking while listening to us. And if you've got any queries, please do follow up. Hopefully you do know how to find us and where to find us, but email either one of us if you've got any questions that we haven't answered. And thank you very much indeed for listening. I think I've failed to unmute you all, so I do apologise, but maybe next time I'll have worked out how to do it. So I'll just say bye now, and thank you very much, everybody.